The year is a grim and pivotal 1943. 2 years prior, the German army had stood poised for total victory, but now the vast, unforgiving plains of the Eastern Front have turned into a catastrophic, bloody meat grinder. The monumental defeat at Stalingrad now echoes throughout the High Command like a death knell, and the war, once prophesied as a swift, surgical German triumph, has descended into a brutal, grinding war of attrition. Across the shattered map of Europe, a growing, dangerous whisper of dissent is starting to be heard, even within the steel-reinforced inner circles of the Nazi regime itself. Despite this looming reality, deep within the dark, opulent, and heavily guarded bunker complex known as the Wolf's Lair, Adolf Hitler remained almost pathologically cloistered. His once firm grip on objective reality was slowly, irrevocably slipping, replaced entirely by an increasingly desperate, almost messianic, and tragically unshakable belief in his ultimate, inevitable triumph. The stage was thus grimly set, not for a confrontation with an enemy army, but for a far more devastating reckoning, a clash with the cold, undeniable, and hard facts of a war he was demonstrably losing. This segment establishes the immediate, tense, and foreboding atmosphere leading directly up to the fateful secret meeting. By mid-1943, the German General Staff, particularly those generals who were actually fighting and dying on the Eastern Front, had grown utterly desperate. They were no longer arguing tactical points. They were battling for the sheer survival of the Wehrmacht. Their reports, filled with horrifying casualty figures, critical equipment shortages, and the impossible logistical nightmares of supplying a front stretching thousands of miles, were consistently filtered, sanitized, or simply ignored by Hitler's inner circle men like Keitel and Jodl, the Führer's notorious sycophants. The senior commanders knew that something unprecedented had to be done, a direct, unvarnished confrontation with the Führer himself. They realized that if the war was to be salvaged at all, Hitler needed to be exposed, personally and publicly, to the utter impossibility of his current military directives. They needed a meeting where the truth, however brutal, could not be dismissed as mere defeatism. The question of who would dare to present this unpalatable truth to the Führer was paramount, and it was fraught with existential danger. The reputation of daring to contradict Hitler was not merely career-ending, it was life-threatening. The chosen messenger had to possess impeccable military credentials, an established history of battlefield success, and, crucially, a steel-backed reputation for blunt, uncompromising honesty. Eventually, a consensus coalesced around a handful of high-ranking field commanders, men who had witnessed the devastation firsthand. For the purpose of this pivotal narrative, we focus on the collective resolve of generals who had seen the myth of the Blitzkrieg shatter into the reality of a grinding Soviet defense. These men were risking everything, and they knew that this meeting might be their last act of service or defiance to the Reich. The secret meeting was disguised on the official schedules as a high-level briefing regarding the worsening situation in Army Group South. However, the true, hidden agenda carried by the generals was a complete and total reversal of Hitler's strategy. They intended to present irrefutable evidence for three critical, non-negotiable points. First, the immediate cessation of all offensive operations on the Eastern Front. Second, the strategic, organized retreat to a more defensible line further west. And third, the necessity of diverting critical resources, particularly manpower and aviation fuel, to the Mediterranean to counter the looming Allied threat in Italy. They brought not just verbal reports, but meticulously compiled, sobering logistical charts, reconnaissance photographs, and the almost unbelievable, detailed casualty manifests that they knew Hitler had not been allowed to see. The arrival at the Wolf's Lair was always an unnerving, theatrical affair. The generals were processed through multiple checkpoints, their briefcases meticulously searched, and their sidearms confiscated, a petty but persistent humiliation designed to emphasize the Führer's absolute control. The physical structure of the compound itself was a psychological weapon. Concrete bunkers nestled deep in the dense, dark Prussian forest, designed for paranoia and isolation. The atmosphere was stiflingly heavy, a mix of damp earth, stale cigarette smoke, and the palpable tension of men who knew they were walking into a lioness den. They had come from the absolute chaos of the front, and were now entering the ordered, delusional calm of the Dictator S headquarters. The meeting was held in a large, windowless, and oppressively functional conference room, one of the few areas in the bunker complex designed to resemble a formal meeting space. The air conditioning unit hummed loudly, a monotonous mechanical counterpoint to the impending human drama. A single heavy oak table dominated the center, covered with maps and telecommunications equipment. Hitler entered last, typically dressed in a simple, pressed uniform, his eyes sharp and his posture rigid. Arrayed around the table were his most loyal functionaries, Göring, Himmler, Keitel men, who served as a physical and psychological barrier against reality. The generals stood stiffly, their fatigue masked by military precision, waiting for the signal to begin their high-stakes presentation. The general chosen to lead the discussion, let's call him General von Leib, representing the collective courage, began his presentation with formal correctness, a deliberate attempt to soothe Hitler's notoriously fragile temper. He started with the uncontroversial figures of enemy strength, using established intelligence data. But quickly, he transitioned to the devastating core of the issue, the logistics. He bypassed the usual flattering narratives and simply presented the numbers. He detailed the collapse of the German railway network under constant partisan attack and Allied bombing, the impossible consumption rate of panzer spare parts, and the fact that divisions in the field were receiving only 60 of their necessary fuel and ammunition. It was an opening salvo based purely on arithmetic, an objective account of an army that was literally running out of gas and metal. The true weight of the presentation landed when General von Leib switched to the casualty figures. He didn't use euphemisms like attrition or wastage. He presented the raw numbers, the 250,000 dead and permanently disabled since the start of the year, the devastating loss of experienced non-commissioned officers, and the terrifying truth that frontline units were now composed primarily of exhausted veterans and hastily trained, underaged boys. He argued that the myth of German manpower superiority was defunct. These losses were fundamentally irreplaceable, unlike the Soviet pool of reserves. For a moment, the room fell into a stunned silence, broken only by the rasping breath of one of the observers. This was the mathematical demonstration of the collapse of the German military capacity. During these initial, fact-based segments, Hitler, who was always highly sensitive to even the slightest hint of negativity, was uncharacteristically silent. He sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of intense, almost frozen concentration. His silence, however, was not reflective, it was accusatory. His hands were clasped tightly in front of him, and his eyes darted between the presenting general and his loyalists, seeking either affirmation or denial. This silence was more terrifying than any outburst. The generals pressed on, understanding that this fragile window of attention might snap shut at any moment, leading to an explosion of temper or a complete refusal to engage. They had not yet reached the core of their strategic proposal, and they needed to maintain this terrifying equilibrium. Having established the undeniable reality of the crisis, the General Staff moved to their main proposal, an immediate, organized, and strategic retreat to a fortified line, provisionally named the Panther-Wotan Line, hundreds of miles back. This was the moment of ultimate contradiction. They argued that holding current, exposed positions was simply wasting men and material. A shorter, defensible line would allow them to stabilize the front, consolidate their forces, and build up a mobile reserve capable of meeting the anticipated Soviet summer offensive. It was the only rational military move left. Retreat was not defeat, they argued. It was the essential temporary step required to secure a future victory. This concept, however, was pure poison to Hitler. The moment the word retreat was uttered, the atmosphere in the room changed instantly, becoming electrically charged and hostile. The loyalists, sensing the Führer's mood, began to shift uncomfortably, their faces tightening with nervous disapproval. General von Lieb continued with quiet urgency, detailing the planned construction of defensive strongpoints, the logistical savings, and the psychological benefits of fighting on ground chosen by the Wehrmacht, rather than responding to Soviet initiative. But Hitler's features were beginning to contort. The generals were arguing logic and numbers, but they were directly confronting his deepest-held, almost mystical personal belief that German will and discipline could overcome all material deficiency, and that any withdrawal was a cowardly act of betrayal. The logical narrative was finally broken by Hitler himself, not with a roar, but with a sharp, chilling interruption. "Withdrawal means giving up territory," he stated, his voice low and intensely controlled. "And territory means not merely land, but a psychological advantage, a commitment to the fighting man. We never give up ground." His argument was based entirely on willpower and political symbolism, ignoring the military impossibility. He began a rhetorical pivot, moving from the current military facts to a deeply historical, almost philosophical plane. He accused the generals of Stalingrad syndrome, suggesting they were simply afraid of the enemy and lacked the spiritual conviction required to win. The generals knew this was the point where the rational discussion was ending and the delusion was beginning. One of the generals then tried to approach the problem from an economic angle, presenting data showing the immense and irreversible damage to German war production caused by Allied bombing. He argued that the loss of key industrial centers meant the German production curve could simply not keep pace with the combined output of the Allies and the Soviet Union. He tried to frame the war as an economic struggle that they were unequivocally losing. In response, Hitler launched into a bizarre and lengthy monologue about new wonder weapons, the Wunderwaffen. He claimed that within months, jet aircraft, advanced submarines, and new rocket technology would completely nullify Allied material superiority. This was a naked appeal to future fantasy, a complete disregard for the current, devastating reality, and a clear demonstration of his belief in technological salvation. Seeing the discussions spiraling into technological fantasy, General von Lieb, with a sudden, desperate bravery, pushed back directly. He cut across Hitler's monologue, a move that drew gasps from the sycophants in the room. He stated, in a clear, measured voice, "My Führer, the Soviet T-34 is on our lines today. The Wunderwaffen are drawings on a desk. We are losing 1,000 men a day now. We must deal with the reality of this hour." He then made a final, powerful, and deeply personal appeal, speaking not of strategy, but of the loyalty of the German soldier, which he argued was being betrayed by these impossible orders. This moment of pure defiance was the true climax of the general's effort. The direct challenge caused Hitler to completely drop his previous controlled mask. He launched into a furious, high-pitched verbal tirade, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and self-pity. He began screaming, not about the military situation, but about the conspiracy against him. He accused the general staff, and by extension, the entire officer corps, of being defeatist, bourgeois, and infected with pessimism. He declared that he, and only he, understood the unbreakable will of the German people. He insisted that the general's reports were nothing more than lies fabricated by weak men. This was the pivotal moment, the transition from rational discussion to pure, unadulterated, delusional self-defense. The Führer then returned to the maps, not to study the tactical reality, but to impose his fantasy. He began to draw, with a thick pencil, new, impossible offensive lines on the map targets that the decimated German army was utterly incapable of achieving. He insisted on holding every single square meter of occupied territory, particularly those he deemed strategically important, based on political rather than military logic. He ordered new major counter-offensives that the generals knew would simply consume the last remaining mobile reserves. His strategy was no longer about winning the war. It was about the refusal to admit that he had failed to win it, sacrificing hundreds of thousands of lives to maintain a personal psychological pretense. Throughout Hitler's outburst, the Loyalists' men like Goering, Keitel, and Bormann remained conspicuously, terrifyingly silent. They did not interject to support the general's facts, nor did they even try to temper the Führer's rage. Their silence was an act of tactical self-preservation, a tacit agreement that the generals had crossed a dangerous line. Their non-response was a powerful tool of psychological oppression, isolating the few brave men who had spoken up. The generals realized that not only was the Führer lost to reality, but the crucial layer of advisors around him was actively aiding his delusion, prioritizing their own power over the fate of the German army. The meeting rapidly deteriorated from a briefing into a spectacle. Recognizing that their effort had failed, the General Staff attempted one final time to bring up the dire necessity of transferring troops from the west to the Eastern Front, arguing that the threat of a Soviet breakthrough was imminent. Hitler waved them away contemptuously. He accused them of wanting to cut and run, and then abruptly, and without formally concluding the briefing, he rose from his chair. His dismissal was curt and absolute, conveying a theatrical sense of injury and betrayal. The generals were left standing in the wake of his fury, their carefully prepared charts and evidence now meaningless scraps of paper. Once outside the immediate presence of the Führer, the generals convened privately in a nearby staff mess, their faces etched with shock, exhaustion, and a profound, cold terror. The private meeting was brief, solemn, and definitive. There was no longer any debate about strategy. The strategic purpose of the secret meeting was not to change Hitler's mind, but to expose his mind. The consensus was stark. Hitler was incapable of rational command. He was a strategic liability who would rather see the entire German army annihilated than admit a single temporary tactical retreat. For some of the officers present, this realization was the final, devastating trigger that led them to the path of resistance. What made this meeting so critical was not just the verbal exchange, but the presence of other, less involved officers, younger staff officers, adjutants, and administrative personnel who were witness to the entire theatrical display of delusion. They saw the professionalism and cold, hard facts presented by the General Staff, and they saw the Führer's irrational, self-serving, and violent refusal to accept reality. The word quickly and quietly began to spread through the German high command. The secret meeting was not only a failure to save the strategy, it was a success in exposing the truth of the command to the very people who were meant to execute it, planting essential seeds of doubt and disloyalty. The immediate consequence of the meeting was precisely what the generals had feared. Not only were their proposals rejected, but Hitler became even more paranoid and rigid in his thinking. The generals who had spoken most forcefully were soon subtly marginalized, transferred to obscure commands, or placed under increasing Gestapo scrutiny. The orders following the meeting became even more desperate. Festung, fortress, declarations, demanding that commanders hold positions to the last man, forbidding any unauthorized withdrawal under penalty of death. This was the Führer's immediate catastrophic response. He doubled down on his delusion, ensuring the swifter, more painful destruction of his armies. The strategic impact was immediate and tragic. By refusing the organized retreat to the Panther-Wotan line, Hitler committed German forces to an impossible, drawn-out defense along an overextended front. The Soviet summer offensive, when it came, shattered these exposed positions, leading to the massive loss of Army Group Center and the capture of hundreds of thousands of German soldiers. The failure of the secret meeting effectively sealed the fate of the Eastern Front. It proved that the remaining strategic decisions of the Third Reich would not be made by military necessity, but by the psychological defense mechanisms of its solitary, increasingly delusional leader. For many in the Wehrmacht, the secret meeting was the irreversible point of no return. Prior to this, many generals had believed that if they could just present the facts compellingly enough, Hitler, the supreme commander, would eventually act rationally for the good of the Reich. The meeting proved this was a dangerous fantasy. For the men who would eventually organize the 1944 plot, men like Klaus von Stauffenberg and other officers, this realization provided the moral and political justification for high treason. They realized that saving Germany meant eliminating the man who had usurped its command. The secret meeting was the intellectual cornerstone of the subsequent assassination attempt. While the meeting was secret, its results were not. When the inevitable military disasters unfolded in the summer and autumn of 1943, disasters that could have been avoided by implementing the general's retreat plan, it became clear to the world, and more importantly, to the German people, that the High Command was no longer acting on logical military grounds. The meeting ultimately exposed Hitler's delusion to everyone who mattered, the generals who served him, the adjutants who witnessed it, and eventually, through the resulting collapse of the front, the Allied intelligence services, who noted the increasingly desperate, irrational nature of German defenses. It revealed that the Nazi machine was being driven off a cliff by a single, unhinged will. The secret meeting that exposed Hitler's delusions to everyone was not a failure of courage, but a failure of reality to penetrate the barrier of a dictator's mind. It stands as a chilling, micro-historical moment that encapsulates the entire tragedy of the Third Reich's final years. It was the point where the rational military mind was decisively, violently rejected, and the total annihilation of the German army became an accepted fate by the very man who commanded it. The millions of lives lost in the subsequent 2 years were the direct, tragic cost of Hitler's unshakable, self-serving, and murderous delusion, which this meeting laid bare for all the brave men in that room.